The sterile, almost oppressive silence of the executive conference room was broken only by the hum of the ventilation system and the occasional rustle of papers. Richard Thornton sat at the head of a polished mahogany table, his posture still radiating an air of entitlement despite the visible slump in his shoulders. His custom-tailored suit, once a symbol of his unchallenged authority, now seemed to hang on him, a costume for a performance that had gone horribly wrong. Across from him, a panel of stern-faced officials, representatives from the FAA, the NTSB, and an independent ethics board, regarded him with an unwavering gaze. Each face was devoid of emotion, a blank canvas reflecting the gravity of the situation. "Mr. Thornton," a woman with severe glasses began, her voice crisp and unyielding. "We have reviewed all the evidence. The testimony from over 50 witnesses, the internal communications logs, the security footage, the passenger manifests, and your own sworn statements." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. Thornton shifted, his eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape, a loophole, a familiar face, but finding none. The comfortable arrogance that had been his lifelong companion was finally deserting him. "And it is our finding." Another official, a man with a tired but resolute expression, continued, "that your actions constituted not only a flagrant disregard for passenger safety and civil rights, but also a deliberate attempt to obstruct a federal investigation." Thornton's breath hitched. He opened his mouth, a protest forming, a last-ditch effort to bluster his way out. "This is outrageous. I demand to speak to my contacts. This is a witch hunt." His voice, usually booming with authority, was now a thin, reedy squeak, laced with desperation. The woman with glasses merely raised an eyebrow. "Your contacts, Mr. Thornton, are no longer in a position to assist you. Many of them are facing similar inquiries." She gestured to a large screen on the wall, which flickered to life, displaying a cascade of legal documents, headlines, and official seals. Each one represented a piece of his crumbling empire. A cold, hard realization slammed into Thornton. This wasn't just about a seat on a plane, it was about everything. His absolute power, his unquestionable impunity, it was all gone. He was cornered, exposed, utterly alone. The air grew heavy with the unspoken truth. His world had ended. He looked at the screen, then back at the impassive faces of his judges. His chin trembled. His eyes, once full of fire, now held a dawning, terrible understanding. He was finished. 6 weeks earlier, the first-class cabin of Flight 712 to Geneva was a symphony of understated luxury. Plush, cream-colored leather seats, soft ambient lighting, and the hushed murmur of pre-flight preparations created an oasis of calm. Amara Jackson, 30, sat by the window, a picture of poised competence. Her dark, tailored suit, minimalist jewelry, and the sleek tablet open on her lap spoke volumes about her professionalism. She wasn't just the daughter of a media magnate. Amara was the formidable head of Civic Watch, a nonprofit dedicated to corporate accountability and civil liberties. Her work involved navigating the complex ecosystems of power, often challenging the very institutions her family influenced. Today, she was en route to a global summit on ethical AI, a cause she championed with quiet ferocity. She took a sip of still water, her gaze drifting over the tarmac. The engines whirred to life, a low, reassuring rumble. Amara had a meticulous schedule, every minute accounted for, every presentation rehearsed. This flight was a rare moment of semi-solitude, a chance to review her notes one last time before the whirlwind of the conference. She was prepared for everything, or so she thought. A few rows ahead, a different kind of energy was brewing. Richard Thornton, 50, a man whose entire demeanor screamed self-importance, was already making his presence known. His booming laugh cut through the refined atmosphere as he recounted some anecdote to a visibly uncomfortable flight attendant. Thornton was a renowned lobbyist, a man who believed the world operated on his terms. His face, ruddy from too many power lunches and too little self-restraint, was set in an expression of perpetual slight amusement, as if the world was his private jester. He had already complained about the temperature, the choice of complimentary champagne, and the perceived slowness of the boarding process. "Darling," he boomed at the flight attendant, a young woman named Chloe, who was doing her best to maintain a professional smile. Are we ever going to get off the ground? My time, unlike some people's, is incredibly valuable. I have a very important meeting in Geneva that simply cannot wait. He punctuated his statement with an expansive, dismissive wave of his hand, nearly knocking over a tray of pre-departure drinks. Chloe, practiced in the art of placating difficult passengers, offered a strained smile. We're just awaiting final clearance, Mr. Thornton. We should be departing any moment now. She moved away quickly, her relief palpable. Amara, observing the exchange from her seat, felt a familiar weariness. She had encountered countless Richard Thorntons in her professional life, men who conflated wealth and influence with an inherent right to disrespect. She silently hoped their paths would not cross directly. She returned her attention to her tablet, a complex data analysis dashboard glowing on its screen. She was on the verge of uncovering a significant systemic bias in a major tech corporation's hiring algorithms. It was a battle she was ready to fight, just as she was always ready for any challenge, whether it was dismantling corporate malfeasance or simply asserting her right to a peaceful journey. A few moments later, Chloe approached Amara's seat, her smile a little more genuine this time. Everything all right here, Miss Jackson? Can I get you anything else before we take off? Amara looked up, a soft smile gracing her lips. No, thank you, Chloe. Everything is perfect. Just enjoying the calm before the storm. She gestured to her tablet, a subtle hint at her upcoming work. Chloe nodded knowingly. I understand completely. We're just happy to have you on board, Miss Jackson. Your seat is all good for the flight. She gave a final, reassuring glance at Amara's first-class window seat, confirming her presence before moving to assist other passengers. The engines roared a little louder, promising imminent departure. Amara settled back, a sense of anticipation for her mission in Geneva and a rare moment of personal peace washing over her. Amara finished reviewing her notes, confident and prepared. The cabin door hissed shut, and the flight attendants began their final safety checks. She gently placed her tablet in the seat pocket in front of her, rising to stretch her legs before the long flight. As she turned to retrieve her small carry-on from the overhead compartment, she noticed a commotion a few rows back, near her own seat. Her heart gave a small, almost imperceptible lurch. Richard Thornton, the boorish lobbyist from earlier, was sprawled comfortably in her window seat, the one Chloe had just confirmed was hers. His large frame seemed to consume the space, and his carry-on, a garish leather monstrosity, was haphazardly shoved into the footwell, partially blocking the aisle. He had already opened a magazine and was idly flipping through it, a smug smirk on his face. Amara took a deep breath, her face betraying no emotion. She walked calmly towards her seat, her movements deliberate and controlled. Chloe, the flight attendant, was already approaching, her brow furrowed in concern, having clearly noticed the same discrepancy. "Excuse me, sir," Amara said, her voice clear and level, addressing Thornton directly. "I believe you're in my seat." Thornton barely glanced up from his magazine. "Oh, really? And what makes you say that, sweetheart?" He didn't bother to meet her eyes, his tone dripping with condescension. "My boarding pass states seat 3A, which is this seat," Amara replied, holding up her pass. She extended it slightly, offering it for his inspection. He finally looked up, a dismissive scoff escaping his lips. His gaze swept over her, taking in her dark skin, her composed demeanor, and the quiet dignity she carried. His smirk widened, now laced with something far more unpleasant, a thinly veiled contempt. "Look, honey, there's been a mistake. This is my seat. I always fly 3A. Always. Perhaps you misread your ticket, or maybe it's for a different section." He waved his hand dismissively. "You know how these things are. Probably some mix-up. Happens all the time with you people." The implication hung heavy in the air, unspoken yet utterly clear. Chloe stepped forward, her voice a little shaky. "Mr. Thornton, Miss Jackson does have a boarding pass for 3A. Could you please check your own ticket?" Thornton glared at Chloe, his eyes narrowing. "Are you questioning me, young lady? Do you know who I am?" "Richard Thornton. I have been flying this airline for 20 years, first class, always 3A. This is an outrage." "And you?" He sneered at Amara. "I'm sure there's a lovely seat for you further back. Perhaps an economy? More your speed, I imagine." He chuckled, a harsh, grating sound, and went back to his magazine, effectively dismissing her. Amara's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She felt the microaggressions, the passive aggression, the deliberate belittling, but her face remained a mask of cool detachment. She was not a victim. Chloe, clearly flustered and intimidated by Thornton's aggressive posture and implied threats, stammered, "Sir, I can check with the gate agent. But Ms. Jackson's ticket is indeed." Before Chloe could finish, a male flight manager, an older man named David who had overheard the escalating dispute, hurried over. He clearly recognized Thornton, and his face immediately registered a mixture of deference and apprehension. "Mr. Thornton, is everything all right? Is there a problem?" Thornton, seizing the opportunity, puffed out his chest. "Yes, David, there is a problem. This woman," he gestured vaguely at Amara without looking at her, "is trying to claim my seat. And your staff here seems utterly incompetent." David's gaze flickered nervously from Thornton to Amara. He knew Thornton's reputation, his connections, his penchant for making trouble for anyone who crossed him. He weighed the inconvenience of a powerful, angry passenger against the clear injustice. The scales of his professional judgment tipped immediately. "Ms. Jackson, I am terribly sorry for the confusion," David said, turning to Amara, his tone already apologetic and dismissive. "It seems there might have been an error in the system. Given Mr. Thornton's established seating arrangements, perhaps we could find you an alternative? We have another excellent seat available, further back in first class, of course, and we would be happy to offer you a complimentary upgrade on your next flight as compensation for the inconvenience." He avoided her eyes, unable to meet the calm, steady gaze that held so much unspoken expectation. The alternative seat he gestured towards was clearly inferior, wedged between the galley and the lavatory. Amara listened, her expression unreadable. She heard the coded language, the institutional deference to power, the casual disregard for her rights, the systemic bias playing out in real time. She understood that, in this local, confined system, Thornton's assumed authority trumped her valid ticket and the simple truth. The injustice, subtle yet undeniable, was now complete. She had seen this dance before, in boardrooms and courtrooms, but never quite so brazenly, so personally. She simply nodded slowly, a flicker of something cold and resolute in her eyes. "Very well," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "If that's the resolution you're offering." She didn't argue further, didn't raise her voice, didn't plead. She simply acknowledged the systemic failure, and in that quiet acceptance, a silent war was declared. Amara turned away from the flight manager. David, her external calm a stark contrast to the intricate machinery now whirring to life within her mind. She walked a few paces down the aisle, past the rows of oblivious first-class passengers, and paused by an emergency exit door, feigning interest in the safety diagram. Her back was to Thornton, who, emboldened by David's capitulation, had settled back into her seat with a triumphant smirk, already calling for another glass of champagne. Her fingers, steady and precise, delved into the inner pocket of her jacket, retrieving a sleek, obsidian-colored device that resembled a high-end smartphone but lacked any visible branding or conventional interface. It was a secure, custom-built satellite communicator directly linked to the operational core of Civic Watch's Guardian protocol, a rapid response system designed to monitor and address systemic abuses within large corporations, particularly those impacting public safety and civil liberties. It wasn't a direct line to her father. It was an independent, meticulously constructed failsafe, engineered to bypass compromised local hierarchies. With a series of swift, almost imperceptible movements, Amara navigated the device's encrypted holographic interface. Her fingers danced across invisible buttons, inputting a concise, data-rich report of the incident. She meticulously documented Thornton's discriminatory remarks, the flight manager's biased intervention, the airline's disregard for established passenger protocols, and the potential implications for other passengers facing similar systemic biases. She didn't exaggerate or add emotional commentary. Her report was a cold, hard recitation of facts and procedural violations. The final action was to activate Omega Protocol. This wasn't a simple complaint. Omega Protocol, specifically designed for egregious violations involving senior personnel and potential systemic cover-ups within regulated industries immediately triggered a multi-tiered response. It simultaneously flagged the incident to the independent regulatory bodies her foundation often collaborated with, initiating a preliminary, high-level review of the airline's safety compliance records and internal complaint handling procedures. It also alerted a rapid deployment team from Civic Watch, whose mandate was to conduct discreet, on-the-ground investigations whenever systemic vulnerabilities were suspected. It was a silent, surgical strike designed to expose cracks in the foundation, not just paint over a single chip. Amara pressed the final confirmation. A faint, almost inaudible chime confirmed transmission. To any casual observer, she merely looked like a businesswoman checking an urgent email. No raised voice, no dramatic confrontation, no overt display of power. Just a quiet, decisive act. She slipped the device back into her pocket, her expression still serene, almost serene. Exactly 5 minutes later, a crackle filled the cabin speakers, cutting through the low hum of the engines. The familiar, reassuring voice of the captain, now tinged with an unexpected strain, announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We regret to inform you that due to unforeseen and critical technical issues that have just come to our attention, Flight 712 to Geneva has been immediately canceled. We apologize for the inconvenience and ask all passengers to disembark and proceed to the customer service desk for further instructions." A stunned silence hung in the air for a beat, then exploded into a cacophony of groans, shouts, and bewildered exclamations. Passengers began to rise, their faces a mixture of confusion and anger. Thornton, mid-sip of his champagne, choked, spilling a few drops onto his expensive suit. His triumphant smirk vanished, replaced by a look of bewildered annoyance. Cancelled? What in God's name for? Technical issues? Nonsense, he bellowed, still convinced his privilege somehow made him immune to such mundane inconveniences. He glanced around, catching Amara's eye. She stood calmly, retrieving her carry-on, her expression unreadable. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment. There was no triumph in her gaze, no malice, just a quiet, knowing resolve. Thornton, still reeling from the unexpected turn of events, dismissed the flicker of connection as coincidence. He attributed the cancellation to general airline incompetence, not to the quiet woman he had just publicly humiliated. He would never in a million years connect the abrupt cancellation to the woman he had just dismissed as one of those people. The invisible war had just begun, and the first shot had been fired, utterly undetected by its primary target. The chaos that engulfed the first-class cabin was merely a prelude to the pandemonium that seized the entire airport terminal. Hundreds of passengers from Flight 712, now stranded, milled around the customer service desks, which were quickly overwhelmed. Complaints escalated into arguments, frustration into fury. Children cried, business travelers frantically tapped on their phones, trying to rebook, and the general atmosphere was one of palpable disarray. Richard Thornton, still fuming, found himself caught in the tide of disgruntled travelers. He was accustomed to seamless travel, to being whisked through airports with minimal fuss. Now he was just another face in a sea of angry faces, his demands for immediate rebooking and preferential treatment falling on deaf ears. "This is absolutely unacceptable," he roared at a harried customer service agent, his voice hoarse from shouting. "Do you know who I am? I have a vital meeting. This airline will hear about this." His threats, however, carried little weight in the face of systemic breakdown. He glanced around, searching for a familiar face, a contact, anyone who could pull strings, but found only blank stares and overworked staff. He still blamed the airline's incompetence, oblivious to the deeper forces at play. Meanwhile, Amara Jackson had quietly blended into the crowd. She wasn't rushing to the customer service desk. Instead, she moved with purpose towards a quieter corner of the terminal, observing the unfolding scene with a detached, analytical gaze. The initial ripple of her Omega protocol had become a growing wave, now beginning to crash onto the shores of the airport's operations. As the morning wore on, subtle shifts became apparent. Amidst the chaos of rebooking, small groups of individuals, distinct from the airline staff, began to circulate through the terminal. They were impeccably dressed, their expressions serious and unhurried. They carried official-looking badges and clipboards, but moved with a quiet authority that set them apart. These were not airline employees. Two men in charcoal suits, their faces grim, approached the check-in counters, displaying badges to a supervisor who immediately straightened, her previously agitated demeanor replaced by an almost military stiffness. Federal Aviation Administration, one of them stated, his voice low but firm. We're here regarding the cancellation of Flight 712. We understand there were technical issues, but we need full access to all flight logs, maintenance records, and personnel reports immediately. At the same time, a woman with keen eyes and a no-nonsense bun, clearly from the Transportation Security Administration, TSA, or a similar oversight body, began discreetly interviewing members of the ground crew. Her questions, while seemingly innocuous about standard procedures, probed deeper into the details of pre-flight checks, communication protocols, and any unusual occurrences leading up to the cancellation. A third group, comprising two auditors from an independent consulting firm often contracted by the Department of Transportation for systemic reviews, began setting up a temporary office in a disused lounge. Their focus was not just the single flight, but a comprehensive audit of the airline's internal complaint handling system, HR policies, and compliance with anti-discrimination statutes. They requested access to employee disciplinary records and passenger feedback archives, particularly those marked, resolved, or closed without action. Thornton, engrossed in a furious phone call, barely noticed these new arrivals. He saw them as just more government red tape or airport bureaucracy, further adding to his inconvenience. He certainly didn't connect their presence to his earlier altercation. He remained convinced that his influence would eventually cut through the mess. He was a man of power, used to seeing problems disappear, not multiply. He was utterly unaware that the subtle, almost invisible tendrils of a far more powerful, impartial system had begun to wrap themselves around the very foundations of his perceived immunity, slowly, inexorably, tightening their grip. The quiet woman he had scorned was now merely a distant memory, completely unconnected in his mind to the unforeseen, inconvenient screech of brakes that had brought his day, and soon his world, to a grinding halt. The following days at the airport, and subsequently at the airline's regional headquarters, were marked by an atmosphere of hushed intensity. The initial chaos had given way to a more organized, yet undeniably unsettling, form of scrutiny. The discreet individuals in sharp suits, now identified as a joint task force from the FAA, TSA, and an independent oversight committee, had firmly established their presence. They moved with a quiet efficiency, their questions penetrating, their demeanor unyielding. The airline staff, from junior flight attendants to senior management, found themselves under an unprecedented microscope. Amara Jackson received a formal summons to a private interview room 2 days after the incident. She arrived precisely on time, dressed immaculately, her composure unwavering. The panel consisted of the woman with severe glasses, whom Amara now knew to be Dr. Eleanor Vance, a lead investigator for the Department of Transportation's Office of Civil Rights, and a seasoned FAA compliance officer named Agent Miller. They greeted her with professional courtesy, devoid of any prejudgment. "Ms. Jackson," Dr. Vance began, her voice calm and measured, "thank you for coming. Your report, filed through what we understand is a highly secured channel, triggered an immediate and comprehensive review of Flight 712, and indeed, the airline's broader operational protocols. Can you please recount the events of the boarding process on the day in question?" Amara narrated the incident with precise, dispassionate clarity. She didn't accuse or editorialize. She simply presented the facts: her valid boarding pass for Seat 3A, Richard Thornton's refusal to move, his racially charged comments, "with you people," the flight manager David's immediate deference to Thornton, and the subsequent offer of an inferior seat and compensation. She highlighted the procedural breakdown, how a clear rule was subverted by a subjective assessment of passenger status, how a valid complaint was dismissed without proper investigation, and how the manager's actions implicitly endorsed discriminatory behavior. "Did you, at any point, physically or verbally escalate the situation, Ms. Jackson?" Agent Miller asked, his pen poised. "No," Amara replied evenly. "My intention was to follow airline protocol and resolve the matter peacefully. When it became clear that the local authority, the flight manager, was unwilling to enforce those protocols fairly, I ceased direct engagement. My subsequent action was to report the systemic failure through the appropriate channels, as per the mandate of my organization. She paused. My concern was not merely my personal inconvenience, but the precedent such actions set and the potential for a pattern of discrimination within the airline's operational culture. Her words were not an emotional plea, but a strategic indictment of a broken system. Later that same day, Richard Thornton was summoned for his interview. He arrived late, radiating indignation, and accompanied by a junior lawyer who seemed more intimidated by Thornton than by the federal investigators. Thornton, still utterly convinced of his untouchability, saw the interview as a mere formality, an annoyance quickly dispatched. "This is an absolute waste of my valuable time," Thornton scoffed, settling into his chair with an air of theatrical suffering. "Some disgruntled passenger making a fuss, and now the federal government is involved? Unbelievable." I simply took my seat. 3A? Always fly 3A. There was some confusion with an individual. I offered to let her sit somewhere else. Being a gentleman, you see. My connections at the airline assure me this is all just a misunderstanding. Dr. Vance's expression remained placid. "Mr. Thornton, we have multiple witness statements, including from airline personnel, confirming that Ms. Jackson held a valid boarding pass for seat 3A and that you explicitly refused to vacate it." Thornton waved a dismissive hand. "Nonsense. She probably forged it. Or it was a computer glitch. These things happen with the type of people who try to cause trouble, looking for a handout. I merely asserted my rights as a loyal, premium customer." He leaned back, a smug smile returning to his face. "Now, can we expedite this? I have a golf game." Agent Miller interjected, his voice sharper now. "Mr. Thornton, we are also looking into allegations of discriminatory remarks made by you on board. Can you confirm or deny using phrases such as 'with you people' or suggesting Ms. Jackson belonged in economy class due to her background?" Thornton's eyes narrowed, a flicker of genuine anger replacing his arrogance. "Absolutely not. That's slander. I am a pillar of this community. I employ many diverse individuals. This is politically motivated. I'll have my lawyers contact you immediately. This entire investigation is an overreach. You have no right to question me over a trivial seating dispute." He rose, clearly believing the interview was over, his bravado still intact. What Thornton failed to grasp was the true nature of the Omega Protocol. It was not merely about his rude behavior or a single canceled flight. Amara's activation had not merely reported an incident, it had flagged a systemic vulnerability. The ensuing investigation, already several days in, was no longer focused solely on the specific altercation, but on the airline's entire infrastructure for managing passenger disputes, its adherence to civil rights legislation, and the culture of impunity that allowed individuals like Thornton to operate with perceived immunity. The whispers in the corridors were growing louder, carrying the weight of past transgressions that were now, one by one, being meticulously unearthed. The investigation, initially triggered by Amara's quiet activation, was now a full-blown federal probe. It had moved beyond the confines of a single canceled flight, burrowing deep into the operational arteries of trans-global airlines. Dr. Vance, Agent Miller, and the independent auditors were no longer just focused on the incident with Flight 712. They were meticulously dissecting the airline's past, driven by the alarming red flags Amara's Omega Protocol had raised about systemic failures. The first cracks appeared when the auditors, poring over years of internal complaint logs, began to notice a pattern. A disproportionate number of resolved complaints involving influential or premium passengers like Richard Thornton seemed to vanish without substantial action. There were vague notations of customer satisfaction achieved or matter amicably settled, but no details, no disciplinary actions, and often, no follow-up with the affected parties. These were not isolated incidents. They formed a faint but undeniable trail. "Look at this," Dr. Vance pointed to a highlighted entry on a digital ledger. 3 separate complaints against a Richard T. or Mr. Thornton over the past 5 years, all involving verbal abuse, one for alleged assault on a flight attendant, and another for public intoxication and disorderly conduct. All marked closed. No action taken due to VIP status. Her voice was low, filled with a controlled indignation. Agent Miller whistled softly. VIP status? That's an interesting euphemism for we don't want to piss off a big spender. And the flight attendant assault? That's a federal offense. The team then turned their attention to internal communications. Subpoenas were issued for email archives and chat logs of senior management. What they found was a disturbing landscape of veiled threats, veiled warnings, and explicit directives to manage complaints involving powerful figures. There were emails from the airline's PR department urging staff to de-escalate and compensate liberally when dealing with Mr. Thornton, even in cases where he was clearly at fault. One particularly damning email from a vice president of customer relations read, "Just keep Thornton happy. His family's connections are worth more than a few disgruntled passengers." This evidence, combined with the protected nature of the federal investigation, began to chip away at the airline staff's fear. Flight attendants, gate agents, and even mid-level managers, who had long suffered in silence under the casual tyranny of passengers like Thornton, or the pressure from their own superiors to look the other way, slowly started to come forward. They now had a shield, and a legitimate avenue for their grievances. Chloe, the young flight attendant from Amara's flight, was among the first. She recounted her prior interactions with Thornton, the numerous instances where he had been rude, demanding, and dismissive, and the explicit instructions she had received from David, the flight manager, to always prioritize Mr. Thornton's comfort. "He made me feel worthless," Chloe confessed, her voice trembling slightly in an interview with Agent Miller. "Like my job was just to tolerate his abuse because he was important. And when Ms. Jackson came forward and David sided with him, it just broke something inside me. It wasn't fair." Her testimony painted a vivid picture of a workplace culture where privilege superseded procedure. Then came the more serious allegations. A former ground crew supervisor testified that he had been pressured to sign off on a falsified incident report after Thornton had drunkenly damaged airport property during a prior delay. A previous flight manager, who had once tried to enforce regulations against Thornton, mysteriously found herself demoted and transferred to a less desirable route. These were not isolated incidents. They were threads in a deeply woven tapestry of cover-ups and intimidation. The scope of the investigation had now drastically expanded. It was no longer just about Richard Thornton's behavior or even David's capitulation. It was about the airline's systemic failure to protect its employees, its deliberate enablement of discriminatory practices, and its consistent prioritization of powerful clients over basic civil rights and safety protocols. The technical issues that canceled Flight 712 had simply been the initial tremor. Now, the earthquake was truly beginning, exposing not just a few loose bricks, but the rotten foundations beneath. The skeletons, long buried in the airline's closet, were now tumbling out, one by one, into the harsh light of federal scrutiny. As the investigation deepened, the focus irrevocably shifted from individual acts of misconduct to a far more insidious problem: the institutionalized web of collusion and cover-ups designed to protect Richard Thornton and others like him. The independent auditors, armed with newly acquired digital forensics data and bolstered by protected whistleblower testimonies, began to meticulously map out the connections that had shielded Thornton for years. The first major revelation came from analyzing the airline's VIP Client Services Department. While such departments are common, TransGlobal's version, it became clear, operated less as a concierge service and more as a damage control unit for a select few. Email trails showed direct, often aggressive, communication from Thornton's personal assistant, and even from Thornton himself, demanding specific privileges, waived fees, and the suppression of any complaints against him. These demands were almost always met, often by senior executives. "Look at this exchange." Dr. Vance pointed to a projection on the wall, showing an email thread. Thornton's assistant explicitly threatens to move all his substantial corporate travel accounts to a competitor if a particular incident is not made to disappear. The CEO himself responds, "Consider it handled." Agent Miller leaned forward. "And this incident was the alleged assault on the flight attendant, wasn't it?" "Precisely," Dr. Vance confirmed. "It was logged internally as an unfortunate misunderstanding, and the flight attendant involved was given a paid leave of absence, then quietly transferred to ground staff. No official report was filed with external authorities, a clear violation of FAA regulations regarding incidents on board. The probe further uncovered direct financial ties. It was revealed that Thornton's lobbying firm had, over the years, provided consulting services to Transglobal Airlines, generating millions in revenue for his firm. In turn, Thornton had leveraged his considerable influence in Washington to advocate for favorable regulatory policies for the airline. This created a symbiotic relationship where Transglobal turned a blind eye to Thornton's behavior, and Thornton, in turn, ensured the airline's interests were protected in the halls of power. It was a classic quid pro quo, but one that severely compromised ethical standards and legal compliance. This isn't just about a powerful passenger bullying staff anymore, Agent Miller stated, his voice grim. This is about a powerful lobbyist using his position to systematically undermine safety regulations and civil rights protections within a major airline, with the active complicity of the airline's executive leadership. The ripple effect reached beyond the airline itself. The investigation started raising questions about certain regional airport authorities and even local law enforcement agencies who had previously dismissed complaints against Thornton as minor disturbances or private matters. It became clear that Thornton's influence had created a sphere of immunity that extended well beyond the airline cabin, contaminating local oversight mechanisms. Panic began to set in at Transglobal Airlines. The CEO, previously dismissive of the federal probe, now found himself facing potential charges of obstruction of justice, corporate negligence, and complicity in a pattern of civil rights violations. Lawyers were brought in, public relations strategies were frantically drawn up, but the tide was turning against them. The initial technical issue that had canceled Flight 712 was now understood to be a smokescreen for a much larger, more systemic crisis. Word began to filter through the highest echelons of the airline and its connected circles. The independent committee was not just looking for a scapegoat. They were dismantling a system. The Omega Protocol, activated by Amara Jackson with quiet precision, had not only ensured her personal justice, but had exposed a deep-seated rot that threatened to bring down an entire corporate and political edifice. The invisible war had become a full-scale assault on an entrenched power structure, and the walls of Thornton's perceived impunity were beginning to crumble, brick by agonizing brick. The conference room felt colder now, the silence heavier, more menacing than it had been 6 weeks prior. Richard Thornton sat at the polished mahogany table, but his previous air of entitled indignation had curdled into a sickly pale anxiety. The custom-tailored suit, once a fortress of his self-importance, now seemed to constrict him, a cage of his own making. Across from him, Dr. Eleanor Vance, Agent Miller, and the head of the Independent Ethics Board sat impassively, their faces a collective mask of unwavering resolve. This was not a negotiation. It was an inquisition, a reckoning years in the making. Mr. Thornton, Dr. Vance began, her voice cutting through the tension like a surgeon's scalpel. We are here today to conclude our findings regarding the cancellation of Flight 712 and the extensive pattern of misconduct, systemic failures, and obstruction of justice that your actions, and those of Transglobal Airlines, have brought to light. She gestured to a large screen that now displayed an official seal of the Department of Transportation. Thornton swallowed hard, his usual bluster deserting him. He tried to muster a defiant glare, but his eyes darted nervously. This is still a gross overreaction. A simple misunderstanding. I have provided my statements. My legal team has cooperated. Agent Miller interrupted, his tone devoid of any sympathy. Your statements, Mr. Thornton, have been demonstrably false. Your cooperation has been a series of attempts to discredit witnesses and obstruct the investigation. He then pressed a button. The screen flickered, displaying Amara Jackson's calm, composed face. Her recorded testimony, taken in the privacy of a secure interview room, began to play. Her voice, clear and unwavering, recounted the incident on Flight 712 with methodical precision, each detail a stark, unembellished fact. She did not accuse. She merely presented the truth of the events, the exact words used, the manager's immediate capitulation, the systemic bypass of protocol. Thornton scoffed. A disgruntled passenger, looking for attention. Ms. Jackson is the head of Civic Watch, Mr. Thornton, Dr. Vance interjected coolly. Her hidden mechanism was not a phone call to her billionaire father, but the activation of an independent, highly vetted oversight protocol designed specifically to identify systemic corporate malfeasance. Her reporting system is recognized by several federal agencies as a critical early warning for institutional corruption. The screen shifted. Now, a series of video clips played. First, a shaky cell phone video, recorded by another passenger, showing Thornton's animated, aggressive gestures and his dismissive wave as Amara stood by her seat. Then, clear security footage from the gate, showing David, the flight manager, actively directing Amara away from her assigned seat while deferring to Thornton. The raw, unfiltered reality of his condescension was laid bare. Next, internal emails flooded the screen. Chloe's tearful testimony played over a backdrop of damning correspondence. Directives from senior management to manage Thornton to keep him happy at all costs, even in the face of flagrant rule violations. There were the specific email exchanges detailing how the alleged assault on a flight attendant was made to disappear by the CEO himself, with a subsequent bonus paid to Thornton's lobbying firm. Thornton's face, initially contorted in anger, began to pale. His eyes, fixed on the screen, registered a dawning horror. He saw the cold, hard evidence of his casual cruelty, amplified and undeniable. The casual racism, the entitled aggression, the absolute certainty of his impunity, it was all being played back to him, not as a subjective complaint, but as incontrovertible proof. We also have sworn testimonies from over a dozen current and former trans-global employees, Agent Miller stated, his voice devoid of emotion, detailing years of intimidation, unaddressed harassment, and a culture of fear, all directly stemming from the airline's policy of protecting VIP clients like yourself. We have evidence of falsified incident reports, of employees being demoted or reassigned for daring to enforce regulations against you. And we have irrefutable financial records linking your lobbying firm's contracts with TransGlobal directly to these systemic cover-ups. The final blow came when Dr. Vance projected a complex web diagram onto the screen. It meticulously connected Thornton's firm, senior TransGlobal executives, key regional airport officials, and even a few local politicians. Each line represented a hidden favor, a suppressed report, a financial exchange, or a bypassed regulation. It was a complete and damning picture of the localized, corrupt system that had enabled him for decades. Thornton's jaw hung slack. His eyes, once arrogant and contemptuous, now held a profound, sickening terror. The room, for him, was no longer merely a conference chamber, it was a tomb. The walls of his untouchability, painstakingly constructed over a lifetime of influence and privilege, had not merely cracked, they had disintegrated into dust. He looked at the impassive faces of the panel, then at the screen, which now displayed a single, damning phrase: obstruction of justice. Civil rights violations. Endangering public safety. He was caught, utterly and irrevocably. His world, built on the shifting sands of power and personal influence, had been meticulously dismantled by the quiet, impartial force he had never even perceived, activated by the very person he had so casually dismissed. The man who believed himself above all rules was finally, unequivocally, accountable. He was finished. The hammer of justice fell swiftly and decisively. In the days following the intense, televised proceedings, portions of which had been leaked, ensuring widespread public awareness, the consequences for Richard Thornton and his enablers were catastrophic. Thornton was charged with multiple felonies, including obstruction of justice, civil rights violations, and endangerment of public safety through his proven history of disruptive and aggressive behavior on commercial flights, which directly impacted operational integrity. His lobbying firm was immediately placed under federal investigation for illegal lobbying practices and bribery. His assets were frozen pending the outcome of these investigations, and his once sterling reputation was not merely tarnished, but utterly obliterated. He faced the prospect of years in federal prison, his name forever synonymous with entitlement and systemic abuse. The image of him, pale and broken, being escorted from the federal building by marshals, was plastered across every news outlet, a stark and public humiliation. The impact on TransGlobal Airlines was equally profound. The CEO and several high-ranking executives implicated in the cover-up were immediately fired and faced their own legal battles, including heavy fines and potential criminal charges. The airline itself was hit with unprecedented penalties, hundreds of millions in fines for systemic civil rights violations, fraudulent reporting, and failure to maintain safety standards. More significantly, the FAA issued a rare and severe order. Transglobal Airlines was placed under special federal administration for a period of 5 years, with an independent oversight board appointed to restructure its internal policies, employee protections, and complaint handling mechanisms. Their license to operate was severely jeopardized, forcing them into a complete overhaul. The local officials and airport authorities who had enabled Thornton's behavior also faced a reckoning. Investigations were launched into their departments, leading to a wave of resignations, early retirements, and in some cases, indictments for corruption and dereliction of duty. The hidden web of protection, once so impenetrable, had been systematically unraveled, leaving a trail of shattered careers and exposed malfeasance. Amara Jackson, the quiet architect of this monumental shift, watched the news reports from her office at Civic Watch. There was no outward display of triumph, only a quiet, profound sense of satisfaction. Her Omega Protocol had proven its efficacy, not just as a tool for individual redress, but as a potent catalyst for systemic change. She had demonstrated that even the most entrenched power structures could be challenged and ultimately dismantled by precise, strategic action backed by an incorruptible higher authority. A few weeks later, Amara delivered a keynote address at a major civil liberties conference. Her speech was not about her personal experience, but about the imperative of vigilance and accountability in an increasingly complex world. "Justice is not always loud," she stated, her voice resonating with calm authority. "Sometimes it's a quiet, persistent force that identifies the cracks in the foundation, meticulously gathers the evidence, and activates the mechanisms designed to ensure fairness for all, not just the privileged few. Our work is to build those mechanisms, to empower the unseen, and to remind those in power that true authority comes not from status, but from integrity and adherence to the fundamental principles of equality and human dignity." The final scenes show a revitalized Transglobal Airlines. New leadership, chosen for their commitment to ethics and transparency, is implementing stringent new training programs for all staff, explicitly addressing anti-discrimination and de-escalation techniques. A visible, accessible passenger advocate office has been established, with direct reporting lines to the Independent Oversight Board. Flight attendants and ground crew, once fearful and demoralized, now work with a renewed sense of purpose and protection, no longer intimidated by the ghost of powerful, abusive passengers. The air of quiet vigilance had replaced the old atmosphere of quiet complicity. Amara, on a later flight, is seen observing these changes. She glances out the window, a faint smile touching her lips. The world isn't perfect, but a significant battle had been won. The feeling of deep catharsis resonated not just within her, but, it was hoped, with every viewer who had witnessed the quiet strategist bring down an arrogant giant. The sky was now a little fairer, the path to justice a little clearer, all because one competent woman refused to be dismissed.